Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the state of online higher education in 2025. My name is Madison Weiss, and I'm a Senior Policy Analyst for Higher Education at the Center for American Progress. Thank you so much for joining us today. Over the past decade, partnerships between institutions and online program managers, commonly known as OPMs, have grown rapidly. These collaborations are often framed as opportunities to expand access to higher education, scale operations, and deliver new online programming at speed. However, such arrangements also raise critical questions around academic integrity, institutional control, students' protections, data privacy, and even regulatory compliance. Today's panel brings together leading experts to explore the current challenges in monitoring and regulating OPMs and to discuss the promising practices and ongoing research related to equity and quality assurance in outsourced online education. Before I introduce our panelists, there are a few housekeeping items. Live captioning is available using the Closed Captions tab at the bottom of your screen. We will be taking your questions at the end of the program, so please feel free to submit them using the Questions tab on your screen, and the event recording will be available on our CAP website after the event concludes. Now I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel. Joining us today, we have Jenna Chernega, the president of the Interfaculty Organization in Minnesota and professor at Winona State University. We are joined by Chris Medeo, a senior advisor at the Institute for College Access and Success, Amber Villalobos, a fellow at the Century Foundation. Thank you all for joining us today. So we'll get started with some foundation setting, and we'll begin with you, Amber. So Amber, can you explain to us how the landscape of online higher education has evolved in the past few years, and what trends are you noticing?
Thank you, Madison. Yeah, we've seen a few trends in this space. One of the trends that we've seen, as you mentioned, is the rapid growth of online higher education programs over the last 10 to 15 years. When enrollment in in-person degree programs began to decline in colleges across the nation, they looked for ways to remain competitive by offering online degree programs. And online degree programs are popular among students as they really expand access to education for those who might not otherwise be able to attend brick and mortar schools or in-person courses. But another trend that we've seen is the increase in partnerships between institutions and online program managers, or what we call OPMs. So to offer online programs, institutions often contract with OPMs. What is an OPM? OPMs are third-party for-profit companies that contract with public and nonprofit institutions to help develop and manage their online degree programs. Now, these OPMs offer a range of services around online education, such as managing online degree programs, marketing and recruiting students into these online degree programs, and sometimes even hiring instructors for the online courses in these programs. What this looks like in practice is that a student might want to enroll in an online program at some well-known state university, for example. But that online degree program might, in some cases, be developed, managed, and marketed to them by the OPM. So something that we've seen with these OPM contracts between the OPM and the institution is that they can increase risk for both institutions and students. So at a very high level, what this means is that through these arrangements, the institutions are essentially agreeing to contract out the creation and delivery of a degree program. This is a task that we know is typically intended to be a core function of the institution. So we see that there's some room for issues there. And second, by contracting with a for-profit entity, the OPM, these public and nonprofit institutions are sort of introducing a profit motive into what should be a nonprofit and student-driven ecosystem.
Thank you so much, Amber, for such a clear introduction into OPMs. And building on that overview, could you share a little bit about what current research tells us about the impact these partnerships might have on students and their outcomes?
This is a great question. So I'll start at the top by saying that one thing in the research is that students in online education are less likely to complete their degrees, and they're more likely to have difficulty paying back their student loans than students who attend brick and mortar programs. Interestingly, these data typically come from what we know about just online programs in general. But unfortunately, one issue in the research space is that we don't have really great data on OPMs in terms of there is no systematically collected data that tells us this is the number of institutions in the country that are partnering or contracting with OPMs, and these are the names of the OPMs, and this is how much they're being paid, and these are the details of those contracts. So that research is really lacking, which really makes it challenging for us to pinpoint the exact effects beyond this broad idea that we can get from what we know about online ed. But what we do know about OPMs from what we've been able to see in the contracts is we can sort of gauge things like what percentage of a student's tuition dollars are being paid to the OPM and what kind of contract terms institutions are agreeing to. So through requesting contracts, we can get access to this sort of information. But having better data on that would allow us to really narrow in on the effects of the OPMs. From what we can see, it can be harmful for students for amount of tuition that they're having to pay and program outcomes and then ability to repay their debt.
Thank you so much, Amber, for outlining those really important key research findings. Let's now turn over to Chris to help us understand the regulatory landscape and hear about the regulatory challenges institutions face when partnering with OPMs. So, Chris, could you describe what are some of the most pressing regulatory challenges institutions face when entering into an agreement with an OPM?
Hi, thanks, Madison. Sure, I'd be happy to talk about that. So a couple of buckets of things here. One of them relates to how the OPMs are paid by the schools, and another bucket relates to how the marketing of the OPMs and the advertising is explained and marketed and put out to prospective students of the program. So taking those in turn, one relates to the incentive compensation that a lot of OPMs use in their arrangements with institutions. Incentive compensation really is obviously payments for enrolling students, payments based on and related to the amount of students that are enrolled in the program. So obviously there's kind of a link there. The more students that the OPM can enroll, the more it gets paid. And we have seen in the consumer protection space a significant history when there is that type of incentive. What happens? Well, oftentimes there is this incentive for misconduct. And seen that kind of not just obviously in the OPM space, but across the higher education landscape. So that can be a really troublesome issue. At this point, incentive compensation, is of course permitted via this thing called the bundled services exemption with the federal government, whereby if the OPM is providing a bundle of services and not just recruitment services, that the federal government allows it to do that despite the ban on incentive compensation in federal law. Now, of course, states can choose to do things differently, and schools need to be aware of the various landscapes in which they're in order to do that. And students should be aware of that too. Are you being recruited based on a program or a company that has a real incentive to do that? The second bucket is the marketing, the advertising, and really the transparency related to what the OPM is providing to students. And unfortunately, there's been some examples of OPMs that have advertised essentially a relationship or advertise a program that students would, very reasonably think was being offered by the institution, when really that program was being offered by an OPM in partnership with the institution. And students might enroll in programs, very differently depending on what they think they're getting. There are certainly some high-profile and public examples of that in recent litigation. One of them was the litigation filed against Caltech, where the program offered by a company called Simply Learn, basically a cybersecurity boot camp, was advertised as being kind of powered by the school or offered by the school, when really it wasn't clear that this program was offered by Simply Learn. So I think a group of students filed a lawsuit because they took that program really thinking that it was a Caltech program and really went there because of that. And we see Southern California as another example related to its operation of a social work program operated by a OPM called 2U. So those are just some examples of some of the regulatory aspects that would come up, and I'd be happy to talk more later.
Thank you so much, Chris. So pivoting a little bit over to looking at current federal disclosure requirements. Chris, in your opinion, would you say they are sufficient in protecting students? And if not, what would need to be changed to make the disclosure requirements more effective?
Well, I think we've seen that they're not sufficient. I mean, these by nature of the problems that have popped up and the complaints that students have about what they think they're getting and how these disclosures are if they are being made, and it's hard to tell what is being enforced right now by the Department of Education in this space. But certainly, although the Department of Education has prohibitions on misrepresentations and omissions of fact, I mean, number one, it's hard to tell if those are still being enforced or not. And secondly, it seems that they're really not enough to stop schools from really not being very clear with students about what it is that the OPM is providing. In other words, who is employing the instructors that are teaching the program, who is creating the curriculum, who is, if it's an online program, obviously who is providing the online infrastructure. And, students really have a right to know about what it is they're getting. On one hand, is it basically, kind of a royalty deal where the school is putting its name, but nothing else on a program wholly offered by this other company? Or is it an area where the school truly does have the appropriate amount of creation of the curriculum and decision-making on what's being offered, decision-making on the costs of the program, decision-making on enrollment levels, and the students, through the quality of students that get into the program, and most importantly, decision on the quality of the instructors and the faculty who will be teaching that program. So those are all things that, are it's really important that students are fully aware of, and there aren't, minor insignificant disclosures buried on a website somewhere.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So definitely understanding how oversight works is super critical, and we can safely say that when it's lacking, there are a lot of risks for students. Chris, if you had a magic ball or perfect world, what new standards or accountability measures would you put in place, or what are some concrete oversight practices that institutions could adopt to better monitor OPM compliance in order to protect students?
So, sorry, mute there. So, certainly one of the things relates to what I was just talking about, which is an institution being, clearly and conspicuously, and those are kind of some of the magic consumer protection words, explaining to students in all of its marketing materials and online materials that the program is being offered by, or in certain cases, instructed by, or created by, or whatever the appropriate case is, by this other company and not by the school, and that it is separate from the institution. So that would be a critical piece, and that the, including potentially how the institution, how the institution is paying the company, and what services that company is providing to the institution. So that would be from a high level, really critical points. Obviously going to the incentive compensation, I think that's certainly something that, really should be looked at and determined if that's an appropriate thing to continue. Certainly, we have significant concerns about the incentives that it provides to the OPM if truly it's being paid based on the number of students it puts in the seats of this online program. Of course, not in a physical presence, there's no cap on the number of seats there can be. So there really, could be concerns that they are over recruiting. And although, of course, access for students to quality programs is important, is that being done in a way where the programs are cost effective, are obviously providing the quality instruction that students expect? And so that's, probably another angle where certainly it would be valuable for incentive compensation arrangements to be, if not completely eliminated, essentially limited in such a way that they're not going to be a reason that students are enrolled in a program in which they really, they potentially wouldn't be a good fit for them.
Amazing. Thank you, Chris. And just a reminder to the audience, please feel free to drop any questions you have into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So we're going to shift now from research and regulatory oversight to state policy innovations. Jenna, in 2024, Minnesota took a pioneering step to regulate OPM agreements. Can you walk us through what motivated that legislation? What prompted Minnesota to take action on OPM regulations, and what issues were most pressing at the time?
Sure, absolutely. In 2024, we had realized that one of our campuses had signed an agreement with an OPM company. And once we saw the contract for that agreement, we were pretty appalled by the conditions of the contract. As Chris was kind of mentioning, there was a heavy amount of incentive pay involved. So any student that was enrolled in one of the programs being managed by the OPM was taking 50% of that student's tuition dollars for the services that they had provided. I don't think it's any surprise that the OPM companies had targeted our most financially vulnerable institutions. Those were the institutions where they were struggling the most with student enrollment and financial sustainability. But once we were looking through this and saw this huge amount of tuition money that was going to be going to a private company that otherwise would have stayed with a public university, we investigated further. We learned more about OPMs. We contacted policymakers in the federal government to learn about the bundled services loophole and where it came from and how to close it. We discussed with some folks with the Center for American Progress about the research they had done and about these policies across the country. And we talked to our legislators and said, hey, this is a real problem and we need to find a way to fix it. It helped that in 2023, we had passed a free college program for students from families making less than $80,000 per year called the North Star Promise. Like a lot of Promise programs across the country, this was an opportunity for students to get free tuition, and that tuition was then being paid by state dollars. One of the pieces of information that legislators found really compelling was the idea that state dollars, tax dollars, were going at such high rates to a private company not based in Minnesota, but based in another state. And so once we said, hey, 50% of a student's tuition, including the tuition that's being paid by the state of Minnesota, is going outside of the state to this private for-profit entity, even some of our very conservative legislators were very concerned about this and became real allies in getting it passed. Ultimately, we passed a law that banned the tuition sharing agreements between OPMs and public institutions, so the Minnesota State system and the U of M system. Of course, our existing contracts are grandfathered in before that, and so we're waiting for some of those to expire. But we also included language about disclosure on marketing materials, like Chris was talking about. We did have a number of data gathering pieces, but we ended up moving those kind of out of the legislation, and I can talk about that if there's time later.
Yeah, definitely. Jenna, could you also share, looking about a year out now, have there been challenges in accessing or even interpreting how the new legislation may have worked to improve transparency or even quality assurance or even student protections in Minnesota?
Sure. So one thing I do want to mention is right now in the chat, they've dropped a link to a toolkit that's been developed by the Center for American Progress and the Century Foundation, so that folks who are interested in this legislation can look at how to pass similar things in your states. There's some draft legislation in there that's really great, and some other information there. I would say that some of the challenges we've been facing, I mentioned that we moved part of the data gathering out of the legislation and instead, got assurances from administrations, from the central offices that oversee our institutions that they would be collecting this data. I don't dispute, they are collecting the data, but one of the challenges is that this was really the only thing in the legislation that would have cost the state money because you would need staff to monitor that data, to collect it every year. And I do think that there is something lost by that data not being collected by our Office of Higher Ed in Minnesota. So we are struggling a little bit with that. Also, the administrations at the two institutions in my system who have OPM agreements are very much trying to find ways to skirt around the legislation. Luckily, they have not yet found a way to do that, but it is a constant discussion point where the couple of administrators are trying to figure out how can we renew these contracts when they come up for expiration, how can we change the terms of them. And right now, the legislation really prohibits any of that from happening, which was the intent. But they have been very careful or they're being very persistent in trying to go around the protections. Lastly, I would say that one of the challenges is that we have some faculty who are in one of the programs that has been really successful at recruiting more students. It has done so by absolutely packing students into online classes, reducing significantly the amount of time that faculty spend with students, and outsourcing discussion monitoring and grading to another outstate company that provides what are called academic coaches to help with those things. So.
Thank you so much, Jenna. It's really so valuable to hear your experience in Minnesota, and we cannot thank you enough for all the work that you've done to get that OPM legislation passed there. Turning back over to you, Amber, what are some lessons from the Minnesota approach that other states or even federal policymakers could consider?
Yeah, I think Minnesota was a real pioneer in OPM regulation and in the space. So they, as Jenna mentioned, there's really good guardrails on incentive compensation for public colleges in the state. They also had good transparency and reporting requirements added. And I think we also want to see these laws apply universally. So as mentioned in Minnesota, tuition sharing contracts are banned at public colleges, but we'd love to see this done at private and career colleges too, just so that all schools are held to that standard. And we also want to be able to protect institutional authority and make sure that we keep decision making over all things like admissions and financial aid to the institution and not also with the OPM. So I think legislation there should be very clear about that too. And lastly, we want to provide for enforcement to assure that the state can really take action to enforce these laws when holding schools accountable. And in terms of the federal level, I think, one, it's been great to see Minnesota do this. And we also recently saw Ohio take action here in a little bit of a different way. And I think that we'd like to see this done systematically at the federal level too, and seeing the federal take note from the states to really regulate OPMs and protect institutions and students.
And Madison, if I could add one quick point there, I think that was a great point by Amber that it's not just disclosure that we think is really critical. There also should be a piece of things that schools just should not do with OPMs. And you touched on a couple of those. And I think that's an important distinction is you can disclose some pieces of it, but sometimes, some of the conduct really should just be prohibited, permitting, for instance, permitting the online program manager to hire instructors for programs. Maybe that's really something that's a school thing that students really expect. So that's one example. I think some model legislation that we're linking to has about 5 different areas that really are things that the institution shall not put in its contract with an online program manager as compared to just disclosing about it.
Yeah, that's such an important point to highlight, Chris, and thank you, Amber, for that insight there too. Just a reminder, we're getting a little bit towards the end, so please feel free to drop any questions at the bottom of your screen. So I'd love to give this question to everyone on the panel. I'll start with you, Chris, then go to Amber, then to Jenna. Where do you see major opportunities and even potential pitfalls for online higher education in the next 5 years or so?
So one thing I'm really focused on is the Workforce Pell Grant program in the Reconciliation Bill, HR 1, One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And, what concerns me there is this Pell Grant access for short-term programs that were shorter than 15 weeks that until this bill would not be eligible for any sort of Title IV federal money. So now with this bill, just really briefly, folks who don't know, those programs between 8 and 15 weeks could be Pell Grant eligible, not student loans, but they could get Pell if they go through a certain process. Now, through the legislative process, it worked out that only accredited schools that currently would be Pell eligible could participate. So, however, what I'm fearful of are the potentially unaccredited schools, boot camps, and things offered by OPMs would want to partner with accredited schools to offer these short-term programs. And that can really create dangers for students because short-term programs, there's not a lot of data on the quality of them. And certainly we're afraid of programs that promise the moon and cost the moon, but don't deliver for students and waste Pell Grant dollars for students. So, the entrance of online program managers and online programs in the workforce space, which I don't, there's a lot of things that could be workforce. I think a lot of people don't quite envision that kind of thing, but certainly going to be really wanting to watch and ensure that to the extent that there are any entrants into that space, that they're monitored and regulated carefully.
Okay, over to you, Amber. Same question. What do you see as potential pitfalls or opportunities for online higher ed in the next 5 years?
Yeah, first, just want to echo Chris that short-term Pell is a concern, especially in relation to boot camps, as we saw the recent lawsuit against Caltech and that boot camp. So just to echo that. And then I think another opportunity is in the next 5 years, especially seeing what we've seen with Minnesota taking action to move that legislation forward and now Ohio taking that action. I think this is a real moment for states to take action on OPMs. We've already seen students across various states suffer the consequences of being enrolled in an online program that was run by an OPM and not by the schools whose name is on the online program. And I think as we're seeing states really model this legislation, student advocates like ourselves putting out this model legislation, it's a time for states to take action when federal action is lacking, to really move the needle there and work to protect their students.
And Jenna, if you have anything to add in the next 5 years, even at the state level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that there are a lot of opportunities. I absolutely agree with both Chris and Amber's assessments thus far. Clearly, the federal government, while I would love for them to take action, I don't believe is going to take action soon on OPMs. But I think that there are opportunities at the state level, and there are other kinds of opportunities too. One of the issues we faced was a real concern over the intellectual property rights of our faculty who were being asked, or in some cases coerced, to teach in the OPM program, and what happened to their intellectual property. Who did it belong to? What could the OPM do with it? Those are things that are addressed in our state legislation, but they're also the kinds of things that faculty unions can bargain over. Intellectual property rights are often something that is bargained into contracts. And so I'd encourage faculty, students, institutions to get creative about other places where they can put limits on what OPMs can do in ways that protect student rights, faculty rights, and the good reputations of the institutions that end up in these contracts.
Yeah, creativity can definitely be key in moments like this. Chris, you had mentioned a little bit talking about workforce Pell. Could you just share a little bit about what the role these alternative credentials are playing in the sector now? So I'm thinking about micro degrees or even certificate programs.
Sure. I mean, certainly the danger of the certificate programs is that they're not delivering and providing the job in which students might expect that they're going to provide. I mean, the certificate programs and other, micro degrees, if they are helping students, get that job that they're looking for, immediately after getting them, then they certainly could be providing some value there. But there's a big difference between, for instance, often community colleges are providing a very, quality program at a reasonable price. And then we see other programs offered by a variety of institutions, but oftentimes in the for-profit space that are, high expense programs and that don't always provide the value that they are promising they're going to provide. So, that's certainly a danger kind of generally in the short-term space, is that it's sometimes you see higher completion rates because it's such a shorter program. So students can, oftentimes be pushed through to completion, but then really, do they have any value for it? And one concerning thing that I see there is that even the federal law says that there has to be a job placement rate, but it doesn't demand that students be placed in a job related to their field, just any job. And that's pretty concerning, because if you're not able to get a job in the field for which you went to the program for, what was the value really of that program at all? And so I think that these programs, as I said, certainly can add value, but students should be really careful when they're thinking about which they are, and certainly should have all the information at their fingertips about who is offering it, what the track record of that entity or school offering that program is, and is it worth the value proposition that they're paying for.
That's definitely such an excellent point to raise. So we'll be going to audience questions in just a moment. So make sure you're getting those questions in using the questions tab on the bottom of your screen. So to close us out before we head over to Q&A, I'd love to hear from each of you. We'll start with Amber, we'll go to Jenna, and then we'll end with you, Chris. In a minute or 2 minutes, what would you consider your number one most urgent priority, whether it's related to research, policy, or even oversight, that would work to improve the quality and equity of OPM partnerships moving forward?
Thanks, Madison. I think for me, one of the biggest priorities is tuition sharing. And I think what I mean by tuition sharing is that I think that there needs to be prohibitions on how tuition sharing can be used. And I think when an institution contracts with an OPM to have them create their online courses, if that OPM is providing marketing or recruiting students into the online program, they should not be allowed to use tuition share to be paid. I think the root of these tuition sharing agreements are the root of all of the consequences that students face. They can lead to higher rates of tuition for students. It's been associated with predatory recruitment of students so that OPMs can increase their profit. And it's just been associated with other lawsuits for other harms that have been caused to students. So I think a big priority in order to ensure that online programs are high quality and that the focus is on student success is that financial incentive for recruiting students into the program needs to be removed when recruitment is involved.
Thanks, Amber. Over to you, Jenna.
Yeah, as I kind of mentioned, the institutions in our system that were targeted by the OPMs were the most financially vulnerable institutions. And if they had been in better financial positions, I don't think that the OPM contracts would have even been appealing to them to lose that much tuition per student. So to me, one of the key policy priorities is really about stabilizing our funding mechanisms for public higher education, so that we have institutions that can afford to provide excellent educations like they want to, right? Our faculty, our institutions want to provide opportunities for students at the absolute highest level, but it is financial desperation that leads them into these predatory contracts. So I would say, the root, there are lots of symptoms, but if we look at the root cause, it's about trying to stabilize funding mechanisms for public higher ed.
And I think it's up to states now in this time to really set clear rules about what they want students to know about the program they're signing up for, who is offering it, and obviously limitations on who can instruct it, what marketing and branding and logoing and IP that company can use, and then enforcement of those rules and clear enforcement when companies and schools violate those rules, so that students can really be clear and know what they're getting out of the program that they're getting into.
Amazing. Okay, so we're going to start with our first audience question, and we'll start with you, Chris, and Amber, if you have anything to add, we'd love to hear from you as well. So one audience member asks, when OPMs are taking 50% of the cost of tuition for the online course, are you finding that colleges are increasing the price per credit for online courses to recoup that cost?
Well, I think one example was the USC social work program, which was very, very expensive for particularly the type of salaries they were offered in the social work space. So obviously it can vary. I mean, as Jenna is saying, I think sometimes the school may not have offered that program before. So now it's just another program the school can offer. Other times they might have tried to offer it or be offering it, but now they're adding online students as well. I mean, certainly if the company is coming in, they need to find their, cover their revenue and make profit, or else it wouldn't be viable for them. So I think obviously students who already are pressed on high tuition are going to get pressed here even more. And we've certainly seen some examples of that.
Amber, do you have anything to add to that question?
Yeah, I think something to add is that we've seen in some of the contracts that we'll see an initial contract say, like, we're going to take 35% of tuition per student, and then a subsequent contract saying, we're now going to take 50% of tuition per student. So we can see the increases there in that analysis. And certainly when tuition is involved, we can expect higher inflated tuition for the students.
Oh, great. Our next audience question, love for either Jenna or Amber to speak on it. Could you share a little bit more information about the Ohio OPM model legislation? What did Ohio do perhaps that was a little bit different from Minnesota?
I can start on that one. So as we mentioned earlier, in Minnesota, a great thing that we saw there is that there were restrictions on tuition sharing for public institutions. The Ohio law does not restrict tuition sharing, so that is one difference. But the Ohio law did have disclosure and transparency provisions in it that applied universally to public, private, and career colleges. So we see that universal application of the regulation that we like to see, but they didn't quite hit on tuition share, which would have been great to see in Ohio. And I will also note that the Ohio law was really born out of a situation where there was the first closure of a public college in the state due to issues that happened with an OPM. So Eastern Gateway Community College had partnered with an OPM, and the program grew very, very quickly. As Jenna and Chris have mentioned earlier, there's no caps on how many students can be in there. So you have very, very large classes, complaints from students about the quality of instruction they were receiving, financial irregularities that were investigated by the Department of Ed, and the eventual closure of that school, which was part of the reason Ohio ended up passing this legislation. And again, the big difference there is that that law applied universally to all types of colleges.
Yeah, and I can just kind of jump in. And one thing I want to mention is that as we were working to pass the law, we garnered the interest, perhaps, of the OPM that had hired that had entered into a contract with our institution. And as the legislation was moving through the process, they started to send their head of government relations out to Minnesota, and they contracted with several lobbying firms in Minnesota to try to, at relatively late stages of the game, get the legislation to be stopped, or subsequently to be overturned in the session that's happened since then. Was interesting when we met with the lobbyists and the company. The one thing in the Minnesota law that they were absolutely trying to get overturned or stopped was the tuition sharing piece, the incentive compensation. They said, we will take everything else. We will take the disclosure information. We will take all of the other things in there. But can we come to an agreement on tuition sharing? And we said no, because we didn't really have any reason to compromise at that point. We had a pretty strong coalition built, but yeah, it was that tuition sharing piece. So, and it sounds like in Ohio they weren't able to get that in, but they did have the benefit of being able to restrict OPMs in terms of their marketing and advertising for all types of higher education, which is fantastic. So.
And Jenna, following up on that question, if you were to be explaining tuition sharing to a 5-year-old who has no idea what that means in a sentence or two, how would you describe what tuition sharing is?
Yeah. So that's just the model where every student enrolled, the company gets a portion of their tuition. That creates this sort of perverse incentive for the companies to recruit students to enroll and pay their tuition or access financial aid to pay their tuition, whether or not they're well prepared for the program, whether their career would benefit from the program, whether they are a good fit for the kind of program it is, all of those things that we know are really important for student retention and success. The OPM doesn't have to be concerned about, because really all they care about is getting the student enrolled and the tuition paid for. And then they make their money. So the tuition share is when the company gets a portion of the tuition. In the case of one of our institutions, it was 50%. In the case of another, it was 35%. So
it can definitely vary. So
Mhm.
another audience question, love to send it over to you, Chris, to begin. They ask, how is it assured that students are aware of the involvement of the OPM from the time of recruitment through the time of the course delivery?
Well, one of the key times would be in, I guess, online, the websites that explain what the program is. Obviously, interactions with the admissions representatives, explaining, clearly and affirmatively, without being asked, who is going to be operating the program, who is instructing the program. So I think those would be the main touch points in which students, would deserve to be heard at a minimum, but certainly there will be other places, along the course of the road that would be valuable for states to require as well. But, perhaps, Jenna might be able to add more things in practice on what they've seen in Minnesota.
Yeah, one of the pieces of our legislation that the administrations were concerned about was a piece of transparency where if a recruiter was calling a student, they had to disclose that they worked for the OPM. Because prior to that, recruiters would often call students and say, hey, this is so-and-so from this institution, from, the University of Minnesota or from St. Cloud State University, for example. And those students would think they were talking to someone who they could then go and find on campus, or, that person would show up in the campus directory. But that wasn't the case. These were actually employees of the OPM company. And so one of the pieces that we absolutely required was for those recruiters, they have to identify themselves as working for the OPM company, not the institution. But also printed materials, so advertisements in papers, advertisements on the sides of buses, all the places that schools advertise, all have to disclose, if they're advertising for the particular program, that program is being managed by a company, as opposed to students looking at something and saying, oh, St. Cloud State is now offering X, Y, and Z. They'd have to say, oh, it's being managed by this thing I don't recognize. So then at least the hope is that students have that opportunity to ask, what is that? And how is it different than the similar program that isn't run through the OPM?
Yeah, that disclosure requirement of who's actually running the program and who am I talking to is such an important part for students to know what they're getting into and to be able to make a more informed decision about where to pursue their education. Amber, I'd love to start with you for this question from the audience. And then Chris, if there's anything you'd like to add, could you just share a couple points about what are the risks of incentive pay?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So I mentioned earlier that I do think that incentive compensation is sort of the root of the risks for students. And I think that, as we've talked about, that instead of the institution, our institutions contract with lots of providers to provide different services for the school, from things like food to, landscaping, whatever it may be. And typically you pay for the service up front, but with tuition share, you don't pay up front. Instead, they get a cut of tuition each time. And because of the way that they're paid, students are directly affected. And one of the risks is, of course, the predatory recruitment of students. We've seen instances of predatory recruitment where we see students of color and students from low-income backgrounds being targeted for recruitment into these programs. We've also seen practices where students have been misled about the quality of a program. Chris mentioned earlier a high-profile case where the OPM was allegedly telling students that the program was ranked quite high, but they were using the rankings of the in-person program and not the online program to entice students to enroll into their online program. And the cost was also high, and the outcomes were not as good for these students, or there weren't really data there to suggest that yet. But I think the biggest risks for students are being misled about the quality of the program, and then the financial struggles that students can face taking out student debt to pay for programs that may not have high returns. They may be high priced but low quality.
Yeah, and I would just add, when the incentive for the company enrolling students is to make money based on each one they enroll, my real question then is, how often are they really telling a student, this isn't a good program for you, you should enroll at a different school? Because I think students would expect to be told that if that was true. But I think that generally speaking, right, the incentive for that person instead would be to say, well, look, we have this other program that maybe you should be in if we don't have the one you're looking for, or this one is close enough for you when in fact it may not be. So those would be certainly problematic conduct that has been seen kind of in the higher ed space generally, not necessarily talking specifically about OPMs, but certainly seen schools do that when it's been in their profit incentive to enroll additional students, obviously the for-profit space in the past, but as an example. So I think that would be a concern is what is the incentives for the company that is enrolling those students and speaking to those students, and right, trying to make it seem like they are speaking on behalf of the school that has a well-known, solid and positive reputation in the community, oftentimes because the schools that are doing these arrangements are well thought of public and nonprofit schools. And so that's where the rules and potential, valuable prohibitions around using intellectual property and trademarks and logos and branding and things like that comes really important.
So another audience question, I think, relates to something that each of you have touched on multiple times throughout this conversation about the importance of data and the lack of data available when it comes to OPMs. So if you could have a magic ball again, what types of data should federal government collect in order to understand these programs and to safeguard students? I'll start with you, Jenna. We'll go over to Amber, and then we'll end with you, Chris.
Sure. I really think that some of the important data that needs to be collected is completion rates. So when students enroll, do they tend to complete? Not just do they enroll again, but are they passing their courses? Are they reaching graduation from the program in a timely way? If you start to see lower rates of those of completion, it might be a pointer that you're seeing predatory recruitment practices. Students who aren't really prepared for something, students who haven't been, told what the actual workload looks like, students who, think that a program looks one way and it actually looks a different way. But I also think that some of the data about things like gainful employment are important for the government to collect. So are students going through these programs and becoming gainfully employed in something that they like, even if it's not exactly what they were training for? Did it seem to lead them to being in a job that's good for them? And if not, then what is the real value of these kinds of programs? So.
Yeah, and to build on what Jenna said, I echo all of that, and especially the gainful employment data. I think especially when we're seeing programs that are using marketing and recruitment strategies that specifically say, upon completion, our graduates get jobs at XYZ places, or you can earn this much money upon graduation. I think especially when those sort of things are being said, the data should be available, whether that be directly on the institution's website. Like, we've had 36 students in the last whatever years. I think if they're going to be saying those things, that needs to be data provided directly by them. But of course, it'd be great to collect in a systematic way. But ultimately, I think this gets at students deserve that transparency and to know what they're paying for and to know what they're getting themselves into. So I think gainful employment data is key in this space.
On a different side, one thing I would like to see is how much is being spent on instruction by the school and the OPM. We call that instructional spending amounts. So, and particularly if there's an online program and an on-ground program kind of at the same credential, same topic, right? Is how much is being spent on the on-ground program compared to the cost and the tuition? How much is being spent in an online program? I mean, obviously an online program doesn't have a physical space that they need to rent and provide to students. So that being said, are they charging the same amount or more? And why? I mean, it would be, I think students would, reasonably expect that it would be cheaper in an online program. So I think that's an important point.
And to our last question from the audience, it's a bit of a two-parter. The audience member asks, from a student perspective, how big is the scale of the use of OPMs? Is this a more recent trend? How could a student recognize that they are talking to an OPM? Love to start with you, Amber, and Jenna and Chris, please feel free to hop in.
I think this is such a great question. We don't have great data on where the OPMs are, but we know that there are many OPMs and that the growth has been pretty systematic over the last 10 to 15 years. And the second part of the question was how students will know.
Yeah, so how could a prospective student know that they might be interacting with an OPM?
That is also a really important question. And I think the unfortunate case is that sometimes students don't know. They just simply don't know. I think if you go out and have a conversation at a dinner party about student debt, people are like, I know what student debt is. But if you talk about OPMs, I don't think that that is a phrase or a term that people are familiar with. And so I don't think that students can know, but I think that by us doing the advocacy work and talking about this issue, students can be empowered to ask when schools are not being transparent, to ask these questions about who's going to be teaching these courses, is this run at the school, these kinds of things, especially with the lawsuits that we've seen and the media attention that OPMs have been getting. I'm glad to see that it's being more talked about so that the many students who are interested in online education can ask these questions and know what they're getting into before they pay for it and make sure that they're getting access to what they think they're getting access to.
Yeah, I would add that if they're in Minnesota or it sounds like Ohio, they will see they will know that they're interacting with an OPM because someone will have to say, or they will see it on the advertisement. It's not always the case. If you see an advertisement for a specific program, as opposed to a university or an institution, right? So instead of, such and such community college, it's a advertisement for a specific online only program. That's not always an OPM, but it may be an indicator that it could be an OPM because the OPMs aren't going to be running advertisements for the school in general. They're going to be trying to track students into a particular program. So that's one place where if you see that and you're interested in it, it's worth asking more questions. Like, hey, I saw this advertisement for this program. Can you tell me more about it? How long has it been around? What are the success rates for students? Can I watch a class happen? Things like that to try to find out more about what the situation is.
And to me, instructor quality is such an important point. I mean, students may not care, or at least many students may not care about a lot of these things, but they're going to care about how good their teacher is. And that's obviously one of the most critical interactions with the whole school. So is their teacher the trained professional equivalent that they think they're getting as any other teacher would at that institution, particularly if they were going to the on-ground component of what they probably think is a very high quality institution. I mean, Caltech is such a great example of that. So that is something I think is a critical piece that, we need state legislation to ensure either that there is, no ability for the OPMs there, or at least some really, really strong transparency on what it is that students are getting.
Those are such wonderful points and questions for students to be considering when looking at the plethora of options for them in higher education. I wanted to thank you again to our panel for joining us today, and thank you to everyone for watching. A reminder, recording of this event will be available at americanprogress.org/events, where you can register for all of CAP's upcoming events and watch recordings of previous events. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday and a great week ahead. Thank you, everyone.